I'm the Miss.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our series of lectures this evening here at Emmanuel College. This is the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies, and we're starting off a very exciting series of lectures. I'm very excited about our first lecture this evening. This semester we have been looking at a theme of Twice a Stranger here at the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies. And the theme has been looking at migration and immigration, diaspora, longing and belonging. And we had a series of films and conversations. And today we are opening it up to with a series of lectures. And I'm very excited to have our speaker begin his presentation on an incredible book he just written. It's called The Greeks in the Making of Modern Egypt. It's a newly published book. The book is there if you want to purchase it. Our guest is Dr. Alexander Kitroeff of Harvard College in Pennsylvania. He's a well-respected scholar. He's written incredible work on the history of the Mediterranean. And I told him before we took a nice walk on campus, it's especially nice for somebody that grew up in Greece to hear some of the stories from the other side of the Mediterranean. And one of the focuses of the Institute in general has been to bring the people of the Mediterranean together and how the sea connects us together. And I think tonight we are going to be right on the mission. Without further ado, I want to bring forward Professor Kitroeff and welcome him to Emmanuel. And thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to this.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kitroeff, for the invitation. Thanks to all of you for being here, including the General Counsel. Thanks for making the time. I'm going to tell you a story, basically, a story which is behind the book. My connection. Yes. So my connection with this topic, the Greeks in Egypt, which is they are the largest Greek diaspora community from the 19th century until the early 20th century, is both personal, because my family, my father's side was from there, and also, I wanted to see the side. Yes. My father's side of the family is from there, and academic. And last year I got hold of some papers of my grandfather, which reminded me of the first thing that one should say about the Greeks in Egypt, which is that they lived in a very cosmopolitan society. From the early 19th century right to the 1950s, when nationalism took over in Egypt, it was very cosmopolitan. My family went there in the late 19th century. My great-grandfather, Alexandros Kitroeff, left the island of Chios in the Aegean, went down to Egypt to work in the cotton industry, in the cotton exporting, which was the mainstay of Egypt's economy. And my grandfather was born there, my grandmother was born there, my father was born there. I was the first generation to be born in Greece. My grandfather, I grew up, the whole family, because of the nationalism of the 1950s, the whole family had come back to Greece, aside from my grandfather, who stayed on, he was trying to stay on. And in 1962, they nationalized the company he was working for. Therefore, he had to go, although, as far as I remember, my father was telling me that he really wanted to stay, even though where he worked had been nationalized. And I found the papers that he needed to get together so that he can go from Egypt to Greece. And it shows you the cosmopolitan character of Egyptian society. This is his birth certificate, which is in Arabic and French. This is his baptism. He was baptized Greek Orthodox. It's in Greek because it's from the Patriarchate of Alexandria. Then he's got a letter confirming his employment, which he was going to need in Greece for pension purposes. And he's got one letter in Arabic confirming that. And then he's got one letter confirming that in English as well. And that shows you the cosmopolitan character of the society. Someone's personal papers are in several languages. I grew up hearing stories from the family about how wonderful life in Egypt was, how the Greeks got on with the Egyptians, how they got on with other foreigners, how the society was wealthy, it was cosmopolitan, it was fun. Alexandria was a city with a very large Greek element as well as other foreign communities. This is the typical cosmopolitan Mediterranean port that existed in the late 19th century through to the 20th century. And Alexandria at that time had 30,000 Greeks. That makes it the second largest urban concentration of Greeks after Istanbul, Constantinople, which had more Greeks, although their numbers were going to decline later on. Here in the United States, of course, immigration had started. Chicago had about 20,000 Greeks, slightly more than New York. Chicago was called Chicagopolis at that time because of the number of Greeks, but it shows you the significance of Alexandria. All the stories were of having the leisurely fun, the legendary Greek coffee shops and pastry shops in Alexandria, and what fun those were to be in. And the best thing, this is a childhood memory, they opened a very high-class type of beach in Athens. Some of you may know it. It's the Asteras Vouliagmenis. And through some connections, my father got some free passes, and we went as a child very soon, I think, after it was open. And then I went home and told my Alexandrian grandmother, oh, you know, this is fantastic beach, Asteras, there's showers, there's umbrellas, there's chaiselong, blah, blah. And, you know, my grandmother, whatever I said, she thought it was brilliant. But for once, she kind of went, She said, yeah, maybe, but really, if you had lived in Alexandria and had been to Stanley Beach, you would have really been impressed because it was high class, all the foreigners went there, it was cosmopolitan, it had all the amenities, etc., etc. Those were my that's my personal connection. I acquired an academic connection because I was studying in England, and I went on to do a master's thesis. At the time, the diaspora was very fashionable. There's a lot of fashionable. It was Greek historians and graduate students who studied the diaspora, because understanding the diaspora meant that you could understand Greece, because they were the wealthy outsiders. Most of the wealthiest Greeks were outside the country. So studying Alexandria meant that you could understand, because they interacted with Greece, you could understand a lot of about Greece. So the first thing I did was an MA thesis on the events in Egypt in the 1940s, when Greece was occupied by the Germans, and what happened was that the Greek forces and the Greek government and king escaped and went down to Egypt, which was still under British control at the time. We mentioned British control. And there were political events that happened during that time. And I met, as I was doing research there, a very important Greek writer, Stratis Tsirkas, who told me, yeah, you know, these events are very political, there's a polarization. You know what, you should really study the broader history of the Greeks in Egypt. Don't just stay with the 1940s, because the 1940s are very polarized in Greece. You'll get a better sense if you spread out. I spread out a little bit. I did my doctoral thesis on the Greeks in Egypt in between the two world wars. This is the time when the Egyptian nationalist movement emerges and starts to pressure the British demanding independence. And I studied how the Greeks reacted, and they actually reacted well to the Egyptian demands. And that was my my dissertation, but after that I went back to Greece, I did my national service, and then I came here to the United States, at which point I started doing other stuff, studying Greek Americans, and I kind of left this thing aside until the American University of Cairo Press, that published the book, asked me to do an overview. So I had to go back to something I had studied a long time ago, and I really had to remind myself of what are the ways that people, what are the paradigms, if I can use that academic term, what are the concepts through which people have studied the foreigners and the Greeks in Egypt. And there are basically two paradigms. The one paradigm is that the Greeks contributed to Egypt. Yeah, they went there and they had some privileges, but their role was to help Egypt develop. And after all, they didn't go there as colonists. They were initially invited there by the ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali, in the early 19th century, because he had come from northern Greece and he knew Greek merchants. So he invited them down, and he really made an effort to modernize the country, and the Greeks were helping him. So the concept goes, the Greeks were contributing to Egypt's modernization. And there's more proof about the contributions of the Greeks, because this is obviously an extremely important moment, not only for Egypt, but for the economy of the world. It's the opening of the Suez Canal, a major project that connects the Mediterranean with the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, and Britain can have access to its colonies through the canal. It's controlled by the French and the British. Digging that canal in the 1860s was extremely challenging. I mean, it was in the middle of the desert. There are towns now, but there was nothing there where they decided, the French and the British decided to cut the canal. And a lot of Greeks from Aegean islands went there and worked. I have visited one of those Aegean islands, the island of Kassos. Believe me, wow. I mean, I've said it with Kassos people in the audience, so I don't mind telling you. It's a rock in the middle of the sea. There's almost nothing. Very hard. The option in Kassos is you either you go into the maritime trade, or there's very little else to do. Life is very hard in those Aegean islands. Mykonos and Santorini from a different planet. These are very hard places to live in. And they went down looking for work and dug the canal. And after digging the canal, and because they knew maritime stuff, they helped the operation of the canal and stayed there and became the administrators and became the people who were helping the French run the canal. So that was another major contribution of the Greeks. The Greeks had a huge community there from the 19th century, and they established their own community organizations. But the community organizations of the Greeks benefited the rest of society, both the foreigners who lived in Egypt and the Egyptians. And this is the first Greek hospital which is built in the mid-19th century. I mean, we're talking about a wealthy diaspora that can build its own hospital. This hospital, at the time, has its own labs and experiments. And at the time, there's cholera and typhus that hits Alexandria in the late 19th century. And this is where doctors experiment and find cures for those particular illnesses. I mean, there are some generic cures, but you've got to adapt them to the climate of Egypt. So, here's another example of what this concept wants us to believe, rightly so, that the Greeks contributed. And it gets codified by the general consul of Greece in Alexandria, Athanasios Politis, who writes a 2-volume book in 1928 and says, we Greek, this is a cosmopolitan society, there's Brits, there's French, there's Italians, There's many other nationalities, but we are here, we have a special relationship with the Egyptians. First, because we have ties from the ancient era. Alexandria was, in the classical era, a Greek town. We've got geographical connections, and when we came and were invited here, we contributed. So in a sense, he codifies it, and he says the Greek is the pioneer of civilization for Egypt. Skapaneas to politismo. That's the contribution concept. There was another concept, and I was writing for an academic press, so I had to take into account what the scholars were saying. Now the scholars, and this is, I'm trying to change the way the scholars think. The scholars think more about the privileges and the presence of the British in Egypt and tell you, yeah, you may have contributed, but you were, first of all, relying on the capitulations, which were special privileges foreigners had in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt, which meant you were immune from local taxation. That's a huge privilege. And you were also immune from the local court system. Your consul came and passed judgment if you got into legal trouble. So you had significant advantages with which you were operating in Egypt. And secondly, you had the British there. The British arrive in Egypt in 1882 and take over the country. It becomes an informal colony. They're running Egypt because they want to make sure that they can control the Suez Canal, which is vital for Britain. And they also want to make sure that the cotton is exported from Egypt because the destination of the raw cotton is the textile industries in Lancashire. This is the classical case of that we learn about with the underdeveloped world giving its raw materials to the developed world, which then manufactures them, and then that cotton comes back in the form of clothes and shirts and is sold to the Egyptians instead of them manufacturing their own through their own textile industry. So this is the scholarly thing. The scholarly concept is that the foreigners. It depends on what you read. Some people get very extreme. They say, oh, the foreigners, you were parasitic. Because if you weren't there with your privileges, the Egyptians would have started development. So you were, in fact, blocking development. You weren't helping it. On the other hand, some people acknowledge that the Greeks were helping, but they really stress the privileges. So those were the two concepts. And I did the reading. I said, okay, let me see if I can see something new. And I've gone closer to the contribution concept, but to try and say something new. This is an example of the two richest families. There were three really big families, three families which were very wealthy, controlled the cotton exports. The Khoremi family, the Benaki family, and the Sabalo family. And they collaborated, they intermarried, as these families usually do. And they control the cotton export. But, as you will see from this advertisement, which is from the 1920s and 1930s, yeah, if you can see the cursor here, this is the French word for factories, because they've also got processing factories for the cotton. So the Greek exporters were exporting, but they were also helping local manufacturing. And in terms of economic history, if you manufacture locally, that's important. I'll show you a much more interesting picture of the Khoremis and the Benakis than this advertisement. This is a splendid photograph of the two families in their luxurious villa in the outskirts of Alexandria. This is the Khoremi patriarch, and this is the Benaki patriarch, Emmanuel Benaki, who becomes very important for Greek history. And this is from a family album that they preserved, and you can find in an archive in Greece. And I haven't got it here, but the next page is, those the sheets with just the outlines of each person with numbers, and they have religiously numbered every single person. Even there's a British au pair somewhere here, or a language teacher, and her name is there in full. These are upper class families who've got tremendous pride in what they're doing. They were so important that they were visited at home by major Greek statesmen who were visiting Egypt. This is Eleftherios Venizelos, and look at the yellow letters. This is one of the Benaki family, and he's first of all he's blown up the photograph. It takes up the whole page, and then he's taken the trouble to write everything down, even the date of the visit, and then on the next page he's actually written all the names of them. So it shows you the way in which they take pride. This is Eleftherios Venizelos, and this is Benaki's daughter, Penelope Delta, who we will encounter again. So these are the wealthy Alexandrians, but as I'm suggesting, they go into manufacturing as well, which is the litmus test. In the 1920s and 1930s, the other family, it's Benaki, Choreni, Benaki, there's also the Salvagos. Here are the Salvagos. This is classic 1920s. This hat was obviously fashionable, believe it or not. And she's got her pet, whatever this little dog is. And here's her husband, Mike Salvagos. And he's on the board of many companies. So he's an exporter, but he's also into other economic activities which benefit them. And they get visited by important Greek visitors as well. And, since I showed Venizelos who clashed with the king, I'd better show a member of the royal family. This is King George II of Greece, who's in Egypt. He's escaped the Germans, so in the 1940s he's in Egypt. And he poses with Mrs. Salvador in her garden, in her villa, for a personal photograph with her. The kings, they don't take photographs with everyone, that's for sure. So it's a sign of the significance of the Salvadors. Quick mention, aside from the wealthy cotton merchants, and there's another Greek presence, very important Greek presence. There's a Greek Orthodox patriarchate. The Greek Church has been established there since the era of early Christianity, and they're an independent patriarch. And this is my favorite. There are many important figures of Greek Orthodoxy in the 20th century. This particular leader is, I think, the only one who holds three important positions. He's the Archbishop of Athens and all Greece. Then the royalists come to power, they kick him out. He becomes ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople, the most senior position in Greek Orthodoxy. But that happens in 1922 when there are clashes with the Turkish nationalists. So the Turks kick him out of this temple, and he goes to Alexandria and becomes patriarch there. No one kicks him out from there. He dies in 1937. Very, very important figure. Another connection, special connection. It's not, Catholics and Protestants can't tell you, oh, we have a church that's been here since early Christianity. No, you don't. It's only the Greek Orthodox who can do that. Let me go back to Penelope Delta, who we saw in the photograph sitting next to Venizelos. I reread her memoirs and I had an aha moment. And that was that she was describing her childhood, and she said, when we Benakis were growing up in Egypt, we were raised as Greek patriots. We had a connection with Greece. Our father was committed to Greece's development. Yes, we were growing up in Alexandria, but they instilled Greek identity and Greek pride in us. However, along with that Greek pride and identity, we also learned that everything good came from England. Everything in the house, all the goods, all the furniture, all the leather, all the stuff in the kitchen, the automobiles, that whatever it was that the family had, they learned to respect Britain. So they were Anglophiles as well. And this, again, to use another academic term, we talk about hybridity, and I hate those terms and I don't really use them very often. But this is hybrid. This is someone having two identities. She's a Greek patriot, but she can be Anglophile as well. So I thought, if Penelope Delta can be a Greek patriot and Anglophile in the early 20th century, then perhaps later on, when the British have got less of a presence and the Egyptians have more of a presence, then maybe Greeks there can say the same thing, but say that we are proud of our Greek identity, but we also embrace aspects of the Egyptian identity as well. And that's what I set out to try and discover and prove. The Greek identity, of course, is extremely strong. I don't have to dwell on it. These are two literary magazines. They're important because the Greeks were going through a debate of what type of language they were going to use. And in Alexandria, it was more open and more liberal than Athens, and these two magazines supported the vernacular. But the Greek intellectuals in Alexandria were also cosmopolitan, which is important. It shows us that the Greeks were not insular. They had relations with everyone. And this is, of course, the most famous example of that. The major Greek poet Constantine Cavafy, who spent most of his life in Alexandria and died there in the 1930s. And Cavafy's poetry is par excellence one that evokes the history of the Mediterranean, the history of the region, and the interaction of the Greeks with other foreigners and other cultures and other civilizations. Therefore, my next step was to try and come up with my own paradigm. I said, okay, you've got the contribution paradigm. Come talk about the Greeks contributing after Politis wrote in the 1920s. After the 1920s, the Egyptians are becoming active in the economy. So we can't keep on calling the Greeks pioneers of civilization. We need a slightly less strong term. What can I find to characterize the relationship of the Greeks and the Egyptians? And what I've come up with is the term special relationships. Those of you who have read anything about diplomatic history will know that it's a term coined by Winston Churchill to describe the historic ties between Britain and the United States. Britain and the United States historically, aside from obviously the beginning of the United States, are generally found to be standing on the same side of world conflicts, of whatever is going on globally, because of the common Anglo-Saxon roots, the common language, the history that binds the two people. It is a special relationship, and that's what, and it's informally used in diplomatic history. I mean, it's something Churchill said. But, it was good enough for me, because I'm trying to think of a term that will characterize this. My next step was to look at flashpoints, to look at moments in which that special relationship could be disproved. The first flashpoint is in 1919, the year this college was established, by the way. And in 1919, we have an outbreak of a nationalist movement in Egypt. It's against the British. But as we know, anyone who's been in Athens during a demonstration will know for sure that a demonstration can get out of hand, and you can have a lot of random violence. So what happened in Egypt, it was an anti-British demonstration, and then there was a lot of random violence, and they started smashing storefronts and attacking random people. And some Greeks lost their lives, and there was loss of Greek property. But 2 days later, again, the General Consul of Greece had a meeting with the Egyptian nationalists and told them, we sympathize, we understand what you're doing. Because you know what? When we see you trying to overthrow British rule, we Greeks instinctively go back to 1821, the year that the Greeks engaged in their uprising against the Ottomans that led to Greek independence in 1830. There's a kind of visceral sympathy of the Greeks. Greeks abroad are not necessarily very radical folk or anything like that, but when they see a parallel with 1821, they will make that connection. And Antonios Sartouris, he wrote this, he's got all the texts in his book, talks about how the Greeks understood, even though they lost property, even though they lost some lives. Next big flashpoint in the history of the Greek presence in Egypt is the Suez Crisis of 1956. The Suez Canal was operated by the French and somewhat the British, but mostly the French. Egypt had this canal in the middle of its country and wasn't really benefiting from all the money that came from all the shipping that went through. So in 1952, there's an Egyptian revolution and we have a nationalist government in Egypt. The canal still stays in the hands of the French with British troops around it. And in 1956, the leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, announces that Egypt is going to nationalize the canal. Britain, France, and Israel disagree and they launch an attack. The United States comes in and actually brokers. The Canadians come in with a peace force. The United States come in and broker a peace after a couple of months. But there's warfare, there's crisis, and what the French and the British do is they tell the maritime pilots who were working in the canal to leave. They say, we're guaranteeing pension and everything, your salaries, but leave your posts. Leave your posts, because the idea was, you know, the ships, Suez Canal is a very big, long waterway. You don't drive a ship through a canal just like that. You need local pilots, and it's a whole process. So you've got local maritime pilots who do the job for you. And if you take away the local maritime pilots, then Nasser may have nationalized the canal, but he's not going to be able to operate it. The Greeks stay. The Greek government asks them to stay, but they also stay voluntarily. The Greek pilots stay, and along with the Egyptians, the canal continues to operate. And that is really respected by the Egyptian nationalists. They see it as a gesture of support on the part of the Greeks to the Egyptians. This is I got this came out recently. It's a digitalized version of a French language magazine, and it shows Greek women living in the canal area who are gathering blankets and stuff for the local population to be used, because a lot of people were homeless because of the fighting and the bombing of houses. So that's two flashpoints that show that the Greeks were actually allied with the Egyptians. There's also an example of the Greeks not seeing eye to eye with the British, who some people say, oh, the British were protecting you. Yeah, they were protecting the Greeks, but there were many cases in which they didn't see eye to eye. This is a photograph. That's not it. This is him. This is a photograph of. It's a Greek agronomist. This is a very long story, which I will summarize. Cotton, the plant, after 5 or 6 years, because of the soil deteriorates, it loses its quality. Cotton, to make good quality cotton shirts, you need to be able to stretch the cotton a lot, so it needs to be a very strong fiber. And that fiber weakens after 5, 6 years of cultivating it in the same land, even if you do crop rotation. So you've got experts, agronomists, who are experimenting, trying to find different types that are going to be just as good as the one that was deteriorating. Now, the British complain about that because when you send a different type of cotton up to the textile factories in Lancashire, they've got to fiddle around with their machinery to do whatever they've got to do to adapt them. And after a while, they start complaining because, as we know, time is money. And they actually ask the British, stop improving the Egyptian cotton. And the exporters and the agronomists say, wait a minute, you know, if we stop improving it, its price is going to drop. And even though the foreigners are getting most of the profits, Egypt is also profiting. So you actually want to reduce the country's profits because you're interested in the Lancashire textile factories and their interests. So there's a clash. In the end, the improvements the improvements are made, are accepted. But it took a struggle between the Greek exporters, the Egyptians on the one side, and the British officials and the textile factories. A couple of other examples of contribution, economic contribution, in other words, the Greeks being not in the export sector, which is where they were mainly, but they were also in manufacturing. This is a famous. This is Egypt's answer to Coca-Cola or Pepsi, if I may allowed to say that. At the time, it's called aerated. I mean, it's sodas, but it's called aerated waters, and they introduce aerated waters. And I remember this I had in my dissertation. So my professor was an economic historian. So I thought, you know what? I found, Spathis Cola was the first soda I didn't call it soda because we were in England, so you don't call it. It was the first fizzy water in Egypt. I waited for him to be impressed, and he said, so what? And I said, what do you mean? It's important. He said, yes, it's important. But the importance is not just that there's a Greek who's got the fizzy waters, but the factories and the technology needed for these drinks mean that they can be adapted for other things. The know-how can then spread out. There's a kind of, this is very economic. He was a really important economic historian. The idea is, I was just going in, hey, the Greeks did this, yay. Yeah, and he was telling me, yeah, of course they did, but the significance is much more than what you think. They did not just introduce aerated waters, but they introduced a particular technology that was adapted for many other industrial purposes. Another contribution was the cigarette manufacturing. The Greek manufacturers, the Ottoman Empire nationalized its tobacco industry. Greeks left the Ottoman Empire, went to Egypt, and contributed in the sense that they established something which became world famous, which was the Egyptian cigarette, based with blends of tobacco which were from Greece and from Turkey. Now, contribution. It was a contribution at the time when the horrible effects of cancer were not known, and smoking was a social activity and widespread. One of those, another tobacco manufacturer was Nestor Giannaklis, and what Nestor Giannaklis is, he branches away from cigarettes, and he starts a vineyard, which is a crazy idea in the middle of the desert. And what he does is he's read ancient Greek texts that say that there was wine cultivation in the Nile in the ancient era. He verifies those texts and says, okay, well, if you can grow vines in the ancient era, why couldn't you do them now? It takes 30 years. It takes 30 years of irrigation, of bringing wine experts from Greece, vines, everything. And it exists now. You can actually visit Egypt and go on one of these, the type of things that you go on Napa Valley. So again, another big contribution to Egypt, which remains as a major aspect of the country's economy. Two more examples of manufacturers contributing. These are the Kotsika brothers, who also start again, they start an alcohol factory. And then, of course, when I study and talk to my professor, I realized that, an alcohol factory means it's not just wine and alcohol, but it's alcohol for industrial use, alcohol for heating, alcohol for medical purposes as well. So they start one of those first factories in Egypt. And they build this huge hospital outside Alexandria, which remains now. It was given over to the Egyptian state after the Greeks started leaving in big numbers in the 1960s. But it was an example of the Greeks building a hospital, but the hospital contributing to the rest of the country. And my final example of economics, you can tell I studied with an economic historian, the Zerbini family, who are from the island of Lesbos and settled in Egypt, start manufacturing stuff out of cotton. Believe it or not, the cotton seed is taken out of the cotton takes its way to become a shirt or whatever it is in a textile factory. The cotton seed can become soap, can become oil, and this is what the Kafr el-Zayat cotton company does that as well. Finally, the last cluster of examples I have for the close connections between the Egyptians and the Greeks are the fact that the Greeks were interested in Islamic art and they were interested in Ottoman art. This is Adonis Bernakis. He is the son of Emmanuel Bernakis. He's one of the little kiddies in the photographs we saw earlier. He is an avid collector. He's an avid collector of Islamic art, and his collection will eventually go off to Greece and become part of the Bernaki Museum, which is a house that the Bernakis will give to the Greek state, which will house his Islamic collection. It's now part of a separate museum. But just stop and think a little bit. These are Europeans. They're in Egypt, and they're interested in Islamic art. That, for me, tells me that this is not an exploitative relationship. They have some respect for the culture that they find themselves in, and they have indeed, in fact, in many ways, I mean, I know art collecting is fraught, but in many ways they've preserved a lot of the cultural treasures of that country. More recently, we found out, this is really recent, this is April 5, 2017, this is Sotheby's, the well-known house where you sell, auction off valuables and artifacts. And Argini Salvago, the lady with the odd-shaped hat, the wife of Miguel Salvagos, the exporter and the manufacturer, was also interested in Ottoman art and had an important collection of Ottoman fabrics, and they were preserved. She preserved them, kept them, and eventually the family decided that they had to sell them in Sotheby's. But again, we have an example of Greeks in Egypt thinking about respecting and interacting with the local culture. This is what I mean by special relationship. And literally the last example, I mentioned Stratis Tsirkas, the writer. We have this phenomenon that a lot of Greeks, the Greeks of all the Greeks are the ones who go into the hinterland. They go into the small towns, they go into the south of Egypt and get established and work as representatives of cotton factories, cotton exporters, etc. So he becomes an important Greek writer of the 20th century with things he's going to write in the 1950s and 1960s. But in 1939, he's going to write a book of poetry called the Felachs or Felaim. This is in Greek, obviously it came out in Greek. But he is writing about the Egyptian peasants. I can't even tell you what the British were talking about, how the British described the Egyptian peasants. It was the classic racist, oriental, whatever, that they need to be beaten into submission, etc. This is what the British officials were saying. And we have a Greek who's working in the cotton sector, who's gone down into the provinces, gets inspired by the life of toil that he sees, and writes his first poetry collection about their lives and dedicated to them. And then he follows up in the 1950s with a novel about Egypt as well. In thinking now more generally about everything I've said and my idea that the Greeks in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Greeks outside Greece, operate not as colonists. Maybe calling them pioneers of civilization, especially for the later stages, might be pushing it but they operate in a more equitable way than the British and the foreigners. Why does that happen? And I think it connects with a couple, two, three more general characteristics of the Greek diaspora that I wanted to share with you. The first thing is that the Greek abroad cannot take anything for granted. The Greeks don't have a great power backing them up. It's not the Greeks, it's the British who do gunboat diplomacy. They send their warships to other countries underneath the palace of the ruler and tell him, how about doing what we want to tell you? By the way, our guns are trained on your palace. It's not the Greeks, it's the French who can march into other embassies and talk about the might of the French army, the might of the French civilization. It's not the Greeks. 1920s, 1930s, the Italians were very aggressive in the Mediterranean because they believed the Mediterranean was their sea, Mare Nostrum, they called it, our sea. The Greeks never did that. The Greeks had claims, territorial claims on the Ottoman Empire, but there's never a Greek statement that the Mediterranean is some kind of Greek lake. Greeks don't say that, don't do that. So if you haven't got a great power behind you, you've got to act accordingly. You can't quite be as arrogant as the British, the French, and the Italians could be. Not all of them were. We don't want to stereotype them either. But some of them could because they knew they had the might of empire behind them. The Greeks never had the might of empire. Quite the opposite. So they had to adapt. They had to find alliances. They had to get on with the British. They had to get on with the Egyptians. They had to get on with everyone. And this is a very kind of typical characteristic of the Greek diaspora. The second big characteristic of the Greek diaspora, they're usually middlemen. They're either exporting cotton from Egypt to Britain, therefore they're operating in between two worlds, or they're a small grocer, or they're a small agent of a foreign company. The Greek generally likes to play a middleman role economically. By definition, if you're a middleman, and do I have to finish the sentence? Okay, I'll finish it. If you're a middleman, you've got to have good relations with both sides that you're dealing with. And it's actually appropriate here to mention there's a PhD on the Greek Americans that was done here in Boston by Cesar Mavratsas. He interviewed Greek Americans in the Boston area, and he was asking them, because he had found some information to show that Greek immigrants preferred to open their small businesses. They didn't like staying in factories, even those who went in textile factories in New England. A lot of Greek Americans did so. In general, the Greeks, he found with his work, favored being their own boss. The Greek wants to open his own business. He wants to be his own boss. Doesn't like to be in a factory. There's a greater degree of Italians that stay in factories than the Greeks. It has to do with the agricultural origins of the Greeks, the market economy that existed all in, you don't have big farms in Greece, it's all small properties. So you grow your stuff and then you go down to the market and you sell it. So the Greek cultivator becomes a little bit of a businessman, a little bit of a middleman as well. So that's the second characteristic. The Greek is a middleman, so the middleman doesn't take sides. The middleman is friends with everyone. The third thing is that the Greek is happy in a cosmopolitan context. Most of the Greeks came down from the Aegean Islands. The Aegean Islands are places which saw just about everyone. The Ottomans, the Venetians, the Genoese, the British, the French. It's Grand Central Station. Culturally, it's important. They're open. They're open to outsiders. They're open to foreigners. And therefore, when they go to Egypt, they feel at home in a cosmopolitan environment. Those are the three more general characteristics of the Greek diaspora. And in a sense, my book is an effort not only to argue about the special relationship, but to argue about what to suggest a way in which we can understand the Greek diaspora phenomenon as a whole. I gave this talk about 2 weeks ago in Ottawa. This is the point I stopped here. Thank you. The audience, and then we had question and answers. The audience in Ottawa, extraordinarily, there were a lot of Greeks from Egypt and Egyptians who had come. They all lived in Ottawa. That means a beautiful city, so good for them. But I was quite struck. And a lady put up a hand, and she said, "I'm from Egypt. I want to, what you said about the Greeks being close to the Egyptian resonates, but I would like to suggest another reason for that, and that is that the Egyptian people are also open to foreigners. The Egyptians are used to the foreign presence, they welcome the foreign presence, they are comfortable interacting with other cultures. They themselves have Muslims and Copts. They've had a number of foreign powers. And therefore, in terms of their character, the Egyptians are open. There was kind of a moment I said, "Oh, wow, okay." I mean, I can't prove that, right? I can't, academically, it's because it needs some testing. It's kind of a little bit off the top of people's heads. So then, after Ottawa, I gave the presentation of this book in Cairo. So I thought, what the heck? Let me try that. So I did exactly what I'm doing with you. I threw it out in Cairo. And there, people confirmed it again. I mean, they didn't give me any proof, but they said my experiences are the same. That we Egyptians, the audience was mostly Egyptians, but also Greeks from Egypt. And the Egyptians in the audience said there's something about the Egyptians as well, especially the Alexandrians and the Cairenes. It maybe has to do with being in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Eastern Mediterranean, it's an awful cliche. I will say it and then I will stop. The Eastern Mediterranean is a crossroad of cultures, and it's a cliche. But if you think about it, in areas where you have such cultural interaction, then at least in some cases, such as the Greeks and in Egypt, people seem to be open towards each other, and you can have something that I would suggest is a special relationship. Excellent.
Any time for questions or questions? Kitroeff.
Yes.
I would like to really thank you for this fascinating presentation. And you managed to connect Greece and Egypt in such a nice way. And I was a Boy Scout in Athens, and this is an English institution that was introduced to Greece through Egypt. It was the Benakis family that imported Scoutism, an English institution, through Egypt. That's number one. The second is the role of Cyprus. Cyprus brought us together in many ways, I think, because there was this common anti-colonial approach and behavior towards the British, especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I wrote my student dissertation thesis on